Imagine a mysterious people, rarely mentioned, but with a huge impact on the history of faith. A group that supposedly was the first to worship Yahweh. Yes, we're talking about the Kenite. Who were these enigmatic biblical characters, and why do many believe they initiated the worship of Yahweh? The story of the Kenite is as fascinating as it is engaging. Let's travel back in time, to the era of the biblical patriarchs, where they appear as allies of the Israelites, always in the shadows, but always present. But wait a minute. Why did the Kenite, a nomadic people, have such importance? And, even more intriguingly, why do some say they were the first to worship Yahweh? These enigmas lead us to explore ancient texts, traditions, and even surprising connections with other cultures. And what if I told you that the answer might be in the subtext of the stories of Moses and Jethro? Have you ever thought about how these narratives interconnect almost magically? Get ready for an incredible journey where every detail counts and every discovery leads to a new question. Let's unravel this mystery together and discover the true role of the Kenite in the worship of Yahweh. Stay tuned because this story is just beginning. Origin of the Kenite. The Kenite were a nomadic group with a rich and diverse history, inhabiting the Middle Eastern region. Specifically, they moved around areas south of Israel and in the Sinai Peninsula. Their nomadic life meant they were constantly on the move, seeking pastures and water for their herds, a routine that put them in contact with various other cultures and peoples of the region. Their nomadic life shaped not only their economy, but also their social and religious practices. Historically, the Kenite are often associated with the Midianites, another nomadic group from the same region. This association is relevant because the Midianites have a significant presence in ancient texts, including the Bible. The origin of the Kenite, like that of many ancient peoples, is shrouded in mystery, but is distinguished by their Semitic roots. This means they shared a linguistic and cultural heritage with other Semitic peoples, such as the Hebrews and the Arabs. The oral and written traditions of the Kenite were passed down from generation to generation, keeping the memory of their origins and practices alive. This transmission of knowledge was crucial for the group's survival and cohesion, especially in an environment as challenging as the desert. Their nomadic lifestyle allowed for rapid adaptation to environmental and social changes, which may have contributed to their longevity as an ethnic group. The Kenite also played an important role in the trade routes of the time, serving as intermediaries between different cultures and nations. Their knowledge of desert routes and negotiating skills were highly valued. This not only ensured their economic survival, but also placed them in a position of cultural and religious influence. Finally, the Kenite relationship with the land is an essential part of their identity. They didn't just inhabit the land, they knew it intimately, understanding its cycles and secrets. This connection with the land influenced their religious and social practices, making them a group deeply rooted in their environment, despite their nomadic lifestyle. Biblical references. The Kenite are mentioned in several Bible passages, mainly in the Old Testament. These references provide a glimpse into their historical and cultural importance. In Judges 1 verse 16, for example, there is a specific mention of the Kenite as allies of the Israelites, highlighting their integration and cooperation with other peoples in the region. Such alliances were common in antiquity and often resulted in significant cultural exchanges. In 1 Samuel 15 verse 6, the Kenite are mentioned again, this time in a war context. Here, the text describes how the Kenite were spared during a military campaign because of their friendship with the Israelites. This episode reflects the complex web of political and social relations of the time, where loyalty and friendship ties could determine a group's survival. A central figure in the connection between the Kenite and the Israelites is Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. Jethro is described as a Midianite priest and is often identified as a Kenite. His relationship with Moses is significant, not only from a personal point of view, but also from a religious one. Jethro's presence in the biblical narrative suggests an exchange of ideas and religious practices between the two groups. The figure of Jethro is particularly interesting because he is portrayed as a wise and influential advisor. In Exodus 18, Jethro advises Moses on the organization of the Israelite people, suggesting the appointment of judges to help him administer justice. This advice had a lasting impact on the social and administrative structure of the Israelites, indicating the deep influence of the Kenite. Finally, the biblical references to the Kenite not only highlight their existence, but also suggest a mutual influence with the Israelites. This interaction would have significant implications for the development of religious and social practices in the region, evidencing the interconnectedness of cultures in the ancient Middle East. In this way, the Kenite appear in ancient history not only as a nomadic people, but as a significant influence on the traditions and practices of the Israelites. Through biblical references, we can better understand the complex network of relationships that shaped the cultural and religious development of the region. Relationship with Moses. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, is an interesting and complex figure within biblical narratives. He is not only a Midianite priest, but also a Kenite, and this duality contributes to the complexity of his relationship with Moses. Jethro sheltered Moses when he fled Egypt, and during this time, Moses married Zipporah, Jethro's daughter. This created a familial bond that transcended the cultural and religious differences between the Israelites and the Kenite. The relationship between Moses and Jethro goes beyond the familial. It has a spiritual and intellectual dimension. Jethro is often seen as a mentor to Moses, offering advice on leadership and governance. A notable example of this influence is when Jethro suggests to Moses that he delegate responsibilities to others to better manage the people of Israel, as described in Exodus 18. This advice is significant not only from an administrative standpoint, but also because it demonstrates a transfer of wisdom between two cultures. Some scholars argue that Jethro may have introduced Moses to religious concepts that profoundly influenced the development of Yahweh worship among the Israelites. The idea of a single God, or at least a supreme God, that Jethro could have shared with Moses is a theory that gains traction when considering the henotheistic or monotheistic context of the Kenite. This religious influence may have shaped Moses' view of God and, by extension, Israelite faith. Jethro's influence on Moses can also be seen in ritual and liturgical practices. The way the Israelites conducted sacrifices, prayers, and other rituals may have been influenced by Kenite practices. Jethro, being a priest, would have had deep knowledge of these practices, and it is possible that he shared this knowledge with Moses. Thus, the relationship between Moses and Jethro was not just a father-in-law and son-in-law relationship, but a rich exchange of ideas and practices that shaped the religious history of the Israelites. Finally, the relationship between Moses and Jethro serves as an example of how different cultures and traditions can mutually influence each other. The integration of Jethro's practices and teachings into Moses' life illustrates how the Israelites were open to external influences, especially when these influences came from respected and familiar sources. This cultural and religious interaction between Moses and Jethro is one of many examples of how ancient religious traditions were dynamic and interconnected. Religious practices of the Kenite. The Kenite had a distinct religious culture that included monotheistic or henotheistic practices, where a single god was worshipped, even if other gods were acknowledged. This approach was not uncommon in antiquity, where various cultures had pantheons of gods, but often highlighted a principal god. In the case of the Kenite, it is possible that this principal god was Yahweh, or a very similar deity, who later influenced the Israelites. Kenite worship involved rituals and sacrifices conducted by priests, such as Jethro. These rituals could include offerings of animals, incense, and other forms of sacrifice common in the Middle East. The presence of a priest like Jethro suggests an organized religious structure where certain individuals were responsible for conducting religious practices and maintaining the community's spiritual cohesion. Some scholars propose that the religious practices of the Kenite directly influenced the development of Israelite monotheism. The idea of a supreme God, revered above all others, could have been adopted by the Israelites through their interaction with the Kenite. This theory is supported by the close relationship between Moses and Jethro, where it is plausible that Moses adopted or adapted Kenite religious practices for the worship of Yahweh. Beyond sacrifices, Kenite religious culture may have included festivals and celebrations marking important events in the agricultural or social calendar. These festivals would serve to reinforce community cohesion and religious devotion, something also observed in Judaism with festivals like Passover and Yom Kippur. Integrating these practices may have helped shape the Israelite religious identity. In terms of theology, the Kenite might have had concepts of justice, morality, and ethics that influenced Israelite thought. The idea of a God who demands justice and ethical behavior from his followers is a recurring theme in the Bible and may have roots in Kenite religious practices. Thus, Kenite influence extended beyond rituals and sacrifices to a deeper understanding of the relationship between divinity and humanity. Worship of Yahweh, Jehovah. There are theories that suggest the Kenite might have been the first to worship Yahweh, and that this practice was later adopted by the Hebrews. These theories are based on textual and archaeological evidence indicating that Yahweh might have originally been a deity worshipped by nomadic groups in southern Israel and the Sinai Peninsula, a region inhabited by the Kenite. If true, this adoption of Yahweh worship by the Hebrews would be a fascinating example of how religious practices can spread and evolve among different communities. Kenite worship of Yahweh would have been characterized by specific ritual practices that were adapted by the Israelites. This could include the construction of altars, animal sacrifices, and purification rituals. The way these rituals were integrated into Israelite worship shows a continuity and adaptation of religious practices common in the region. The idea that a nomadic group could have profoundly influenced the religion of a settled people like the Israelites is a testament to the complexity of cultural interactions in antiquity. Cultural and religious contacts between the Kenite and the Israelites would have facilitated the transmission of Yahweh worship. Intertribal marriages, such as that of Moses with Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, are a clear example of how these interactions could occur. Additionally, geographical proximity and political and military alliances could have facilitated this cultural exchange. Thus, the worship of Yahweh may have spread gradually, with Kenite elements being incorporated into Israelite religious practice. The adoption of Yahweh worship by the Israelites would also have significant theological implications. Yahweh is often depicted in the Bible as a warrior god, a protector of the people of Israel, characteristics that could have origins in Kenite traditions. Assimilation of these characteristics would have helped shape Yahweh's identity as the God of the Israelites, distinct from other regional deities. This theological transformation is an example of how deities can evolve and assume new meanings as they are adopted by different cultures. Ultimately, the theory that the Kenite were the first worshippers of Yahweh and that this practice was adopted by the Israelites offers a new perspective on the development of Israelite monotheism. It not only underscores the importance of cultural interactions in shaping religious practices, but also challenges the traditional view that Yahweh worship originated exclusively among the Israelites. Kenite influence, therefore, is a crucial component in understanding the evolution of Israelite religion. Archaeological and textual evidence. Archaeological and textual evidence about the Kenite is limited, but there are records indicating their presence and influence in the region. Inscriptions and ancient texts mention religious practices that could be linked to Yahweh worship, suggesting that the Kenite played a significant role in forming religious traditions in the area. These records are fragmentary, but offer valuable clues about the Kenite lives and practices. Some inscriptions found in sites in southern Israel and the Sinai Peninsula mention names and titles that might be associated with the Kenite. These inscriptions, though rare, suggest the existence of a nomadic culture with organized religious and social practices. Mention of deities that could be identified with Yahweh is particularly intriguing, as it reinforces the theory of a religious connection between the Kenite and the Israelites. In addition to inscriptions, ancient texts, including the Bible, provide evidence about the Kenite. Passages like those in Judges and 1 Samuel mention the Kenite in context, suggesting a close relationship with the Israelites. The figure of Jethro, in particular, is a significant link, as his identification as a Kenite priest provides a direct connection between Kenite religious practices and Yahweh worship. These textual references, though interpreted in various ways, are essential to understanding Kenite influence on Israelite religion. Archaeology also contributes physical evidence, such as artifacts and structures that might be associated with the Kenite. Tools, ceramics, and remains of nomadic dwellings offer insights into the daily life and practices of the Kenite. These artifacts, when studied alongside inscriptions and texts, help piece together a more comprehensive picture of the Kenite role in the ancient Near East. Despite the limitations of available evidence, What we have is enough to suggest Kenite influence on Israelite religious practices. This field of study continues to evolve as new archaeological discoveries and textual analyses provide more pieces to this complex historical puzzle. Cultural and religious impact. The influence of the Kenite on the development of Yahweh worship cannot be underestimated. If we accept the theory that the Kenite were the first worshippers of Yahweh, then their contribution to the formation of Israelite religious identity is immense. They not only introduced the worship of a new god, but also helped shape the theology and liturgical practices that would come to define Judaism. This integration of Kenite religious practices may have helped solidify the identity of a forming people. Imagine a group of nomads bringing their traditions and practices, influencing and being influenced by the cultures they encountered. This dynamic exchange would have been crucial for developing a cohesive religious identity among the Israelites. The cultural impact of the Kenite can also be seen in how Yahweh worship evolved over time. Elements of Kenite religious practices, such as the veneration of a supreme god in a henotheistic context, may have been adapted and incorporated into Hebrew theology. This would have helped transform Yahweh from one god among many into the unique and supreme God of the Jewish tradition. Beyond Judaism, this influence would have lasting repercussions on other Abrahamic religions, such as Christianity and Islam. The way Yahweh was conceived and worshipped by the Kenite and later by the Israelites would have a lasting impact on the theology of these religions. Thus, the Kenite influence extends far beyond their own time and place, shaping the religious history of much of the world. In summary, the cultural and religious influence of the Kenite is a powerful testimony to how interactions between different peoples and cultures can shape the development of religious traditions. They played a crucial role in forming Israelite religious identity and, by extension, in global religious history. So, did you know that the Kenite played a crucial role in forming the worship of Yahweh? It's amazing to think that such an ancient people could have profoundly influenced how we understand our faith today. But did they really invent the worship, or were they just intermediaries of something even greater? The Kenite, with their nomadic lifestyle and ancient wisdom, left indelible marks on religious history. Did their practices and beliefs get absorbed by the Hebrews, shaping the worship of Yahweh? Or did the presence of Yahweh already exist, and the Kenite only helped to spread it? And what about the oral traditions, passed down from generation to generation? Do they contain secrets yet to be revealed about these ancient worshippers? How did Kenite practices influence other cultures and religions over the centuries? Now, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the Kenite influence on Yahweh worship? Do you believe they were the true inventors of this worship, or just important pieces in a much larger puzzle? Share your theories in the comments because this discussion could reveal many surprises. And remember, history is a great mystery waiting to be unraveled. Until next time.